Tonight, as snow falls gently outside, let me take you to a place far from the glow of electric lights and the sound of passing cars. A place where the silence was broken only by the wind through cracked wooden walls or the distant crack of a revolver. We're heading back to the late 1800s, to the raw, unforgiving edge of America, the frontier. But forget what you've seen in movies. This isn't about cowboys riding into sunset duels, nor heroic sheriffs with perfect aim. No, this is about the real people who dared to build lives in places where nothing existed before. Welcome to nowhere. Welcome to a frontier town. You might think that a town is something planned, laid out carefully by architects and engineers. But most frontier towns weren't planned at all. They were accidents. Often they started as nothing more than a campfire beside a trail. Picture this. A group of men searching for gold sets up camp near a river. One brings his brother. Another brings a mule cart with extra supplies. Someone else smells opportunity and sets up a tent selling whiskey. A preacher arrives with a Bible. A gambler comes with a deck of cards. A widow comes with her children, hoping for work. Within weeks, there's a cluster of tents. Then someone builds a shack out of timber, then another, and before long, someone puts up a sign that says, "Post Office," even if they don't have any mail yet. That's how a town was born. No blueprint. Just desperation, hope, and sometimes lies. If you stood in one of these towns, say in 1881, you wouldn't be impressed. The roads were dust in the summer and knee-deep mud in the spring. There were no sidewalks, just planks of wood laid down to keep your boots from sinking. Houses? They weren't houses. They were wooden boxes nailed together with whatever could be scavenged. Tin roofs leaked. Doors didn't close. Windows were made from oiled paper instead of glass. The saloon might be the most fancy place in town, only because it had a roof that didn't leak. Too much. But for the people who came here, this wasn't failure. This was freedom. They'd left crowded cities, debts, past mistakes. Out here, they could start over, with nothing but dirt, sweat, and the promise of ownership. When you arrived, in a frontier town, you had to accept one thing. You were on your own. There were no hospitals, no police. Sometimes not even a church. If you got sick, you hoped someone knew how to make willow bark tea or had a bottle of opium tincture. If you were robbed, you either chased the thief yourself or you let it go. Law? It came later, and even then it was shaky. Many towns were run by the strongest man with the most guns, not by laws or elections. That man might be the sheriff, or he might be the bartender, or both. In some towns, the sheriff was the drunkest man in the saloon. In others, the sheriff was a 19-year-old who could shoot straight and keep a secret. Justice wasn't blind. It was often brutal, and if someone vanished into the hills, they were usually never found again. Life on the frontier was short, and people knew it. You could die from a cut that got infected. You could die from drinking bad water, or stepping on a rattlesnake, or saying the wrong thing to the wrong man. But despite the risks, towns kept growing. Why? Because for every man who died in a saloon fight, there was another who struck silver in the hills. For every woman who lost a child to fever, there was another who gave birth to twins and watched them grow into strong, dirty, laughing boys. People here lived in inches. Every good day was a miracle. Every roof that didn't collapse, every chicken that laid eggs, every letter from back east, these were reasons to stay. And so the towns didn't just survive, they thrived in their own ragged, lawless way. By 1885, some of these dusty, nowhere towns had become real towns. They got names: Tombstone, Deadwood, Dodge City. They got railroads, schools, newspapers printed on hand-cranked presses, maybe even a telegraph line. But even then, The wildness never left. The wind still howled through the cracks in the walls. The streets still turned to rivers when the rains came. And behind every smile was a man with a past and a pistol. Still, people believed. They planted gardens. They taught children to write. They held Sunday dances in barns strung with lanterns. And when the day ended, they looked at the sun dipping behind the hills and said to themselves, "We're still here, and that's something." So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, think of that cold wooden floor, the rattling window, the taste of dust in your teeth, and the hope that somehow tomorrow would bring rain or gold or news from home. Because out there, on the edge of everything, they weren't just building towns. They were building America. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight, let me tell you about something that doesn't often make it into the stories of the Wild West. Forget the saloon doors swinging open or the duel at high noon. I want to show you something far quieter, and yet far more important. A home. Or at least, what passed for one. You see, when families came west, they didn't arrive to find cozy cottages waiting for them. There were no neighborhoods, no brick roads, no white picket fences. What they had was dirt, stretching in every direction, and the promise that somehow they could turn that into shelter. The first homes in a frontier town weren't houses at all. They were dugouts, literal holes in the earth, carved into hillsides or flat ground. Families would dig down into the soil, cover the top with logs or sod, and pray that the roof held during storms. These places were dark, damp, and cold. But they offered something more valuable than comfort: protection. In places where wood was scarce and winters were brutal, the earth was the only thing people could trust. The walls were made of mud, the ceilings dripped, and yet, inside, a mother would rock her baby to sleep while the wind howled just above their heads. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Later, as towns grew and wood became more available, people began to build cabins, simple rectangles of logs or rough-cut planks. One room, maybe two, if you were lucky. No insulation, no glass windows, no locks on the doors. And still, they called them homes. Now picture this: a family of 6 in one room, a bed in the corner made from straw and rope, a potbelly stove in the center, its warmth barely reaching the far walls, a bucket for water, another for waste, a shelf with a Bible, a tin plate, and maybe, if they were lucky, a single mirror. The floor was dirt. The roof leaked. And yet, every nail driven into those walls was an act of belief. Belief that things would get better. That someday, this shack would grow into a real house, in a real town, with real futures for the children inside it. Of course, the house wasn't just built of wood and hope. It was also built with fear. Fire was a constant threat. One overturned oil lamp and everything you had could be gone in seconds. Windstorms could lift roofs, rain could flood the walls, and worst of all, there were no fire brigades, no insurance, and no one to call for help. If your home went up, in smoke all you could do was watch and start again. Privacy didn't exist. Parents and children slept in the same space. Every cough, every prayer, every whispered fear was heard by everyone. But this closeness also meant connection. Families knew each other deeply, not through words, but through survival. And the walls. Oh, the walls. They were thin. So thin that neighbors could hear you crying at night. So thin that snowflakes sometimes slipped through the cracks and melted on the stove. People stuffed rags in the gaps. They hammered tin to the outside. They pasted newspapers to the inside, not just for warmth, but for something to read, something to hope for, something to remind them there was a world beyond the prairie. Despite the hardship, homes were deeply personal. Women hung lace curtains, made from flour sacks. Children carved their names into door frames. Fathers painted crude signs above the entrance. Hope's End, Dream House, God's Mercy. Some of these signs were jokes. Others were desperate prayers. Every home told a story of the family that lived inside, of what they'd left behind, of what they dreamed might come. And let me tell you about the sound. A frontier house had a sound all its own. Not the hum of appliances or the rumble of traffic, but the creak of boards in the wind. The drip of melting snow from the ceiling. The rustle of a mouse in the corner. And sometimes, just silence. Heavy, unmoving silence. A silence so deep, it felt alive. At night, families huddled together under quilts, listening to the wind try to get in. The fire would die down, and every pop from the stove sounded like a gunshot. Outside, coyotes howled. Inside, children whispered. Stories they'd heard from the east, of cities with lights and music and food that didn't come from a trap. Sometimes a neighbor would knock at the door, a rare event, and always a little frightening. Was it good news? A birth? A wedding? Or bad news? A fire, an attack, or worse? But more often than not, no one knocked. And so people built their own worlds inside those walls. Mothers taught daughters to sew by candlelight. Fathers carved toys from leftover wood. Teenagers stared at stars through holes in the roof and made silent promises to leave someday. Or never leave at all. A house on the frontier was not just shelter. It was the only line between civilization and wilderness, between family and chaos, between memory and forgetting. And slowly, over years, as towns grew and railroads came, the houses changed. Glass windows replaced paper. Floors were raised from the dirt. Kitchens were added. Porches appeared. And in some homes, you could even find a piano. Out of tune, yes, but played with pride. Still, many of the old houses remained, crumbling, tilting, but standing. Because frontier people were like that too, bent but unbroken. Their homes, no matter how small, were proof that they had made something from nothing. That they had planted roots where once there was only dust. So tonight, as you sleep in your warm bed, surrounded by solid walls and silent appliances, think of the house with the dirt floor and the tin roof, the mother stitching by lamplight, the father hammering through frost-bitten fingers, the child drawing stars in the dust. That was their house, a house of dust and dreams. And in that dream was the beginning of something called home. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight, as snow falls softly outside your window, we return once more to the edge of the American frontier, to a place where the rules of society were written not in ink, but in instinct. There, amid the dust and silence, three objects often defined a person's life. Not a birth certificate, not a deed to land, but instead, a gun, a Bible, and a bottle of whiskey. Each one told a story. Each one was a tool for survival, and each one, in its own way, offered a kind of truth. Let's start with the gun. In the American frontier, carrying a gun was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Whether you were a rancher, a merchant, a school teacher, or even a preacher, chances were you had one. Maybe on your hip, maybe under your bed, maybe hidden in your boot, and you knew how to use it. But not everyone carried it for violence. For many, it was simply insurance. A loaded revolver could keep wolves from your livestock. It could scare off a drunk who forgot his manners. It could mean the difference between being robbed and getting home with your last paycheck still in your pocket. The truth is, most people never fired their weapon, but everyone respected it. Guns were polished, passed down, named. They were tools, yes, but also symbols of freedom, of control, of the thin line between being a settler and becoming a victim. There was no central police force, no emergency line to call, so when danger knocked, and it often did, people had to rely on themselves. And more often than not, that meant keeping a gun within reach of the dinner table. But here's the strange part. Frontier towns weren't always the wild, bullet-riddled chaos that Hollywood shows us. In many places, gunfights were rare. In fact, some towns had stricter gun laws than modern cities. Dodge City and Tombstone both required visitors to hand over their firearms upon arrival. Still, not everyone followed the rules. And when trouble came, it came fast. Now let's talk about the second object, the Bible. If the gun was for the body, the Bible was for the soul. Even in towns where people lived in tents or sod shacks, you could often find a worn Bible on a wooden shelf, sometimes right next to the whiskey. For some, it was a genuine source of strength. For others, a reminder of home. And for many, a little of both. Sunday services might be held in the back of the general store or under a tree or in someone's barn. The preacher might be a real man of the cloth or just the best reader in town. It didn't matter. What mattered was gathering, hearing words that reminded people they were part of something bigger, something eternal, even if their homes had no roofs and their dinners were thin stew and stale bread. The Bible was also a tool of order. In a world where courts were slow and jails were full of holes, towns often turned to Scripture for judgment. An eye for an eye, some said. Others quoted mercy. Either way, the good book was more than religion. It was law, comfort, and memory. And then there was the whiskey. Whiskey in a frontier town was currency, celebration, cure, and curse. It warmed cold bones in winter and gave courage on lonely nights. It was poured at weddings, funerals, births, and bar fights. It was sold by the shot, the jug, the barrel, legal or not, taxed or not, and it was consumed by men and women alike. For many settlers, whiskey was the only medicine they had. It numbed toothaches, cleaned wounds, and helped the dying pass a little more peacefully. Doctors, if you could call them that, used it. Before amputations, during childbirth, or just to calm a patient who had nothing else to rely on. But make no mistake, whiskey had its demons. It fueled arguments that turned into feuds. It made fists fly and knives flash. It took what little money a man might earn and left him face down in the mud outside the saloon. In some towns, entire families were destroyed by a father's bottle. And in the dim corners of certain streets, whiskey's shadow was long and heavy. Still, it remained. Because just like the gun and the Bible, whiskey filled a need, a way to escape, if only for a moment, from the dust, the silence, and the weight of living so close to the edge. So there, they sat, often side by side, on a frontier shelf. The gun, cold and oiled, the Bible, soft and dog-eared, and the bottle, half empty, glowing like amber in the late afternoon sun. Together, they formed an unspoken trinity of protection, purpose, and relief. They were not just items. They were how people endured. Some nights, a man might pray before he slept, whispering Psalm 23 by heart. The next morning, he might check the cylinder of his Colt revolver, just to be sure. That afternoon, he might trade a day's wages for a flask of whiskey, drink half on the walk home, and use the rest. To rinse a bullet wound on a neighbor's arm. The frontier didn't ask for perfection. It asked for balance, between faith and fear, between survival and sin, between hope and the harshness of reality. And so in those towns built from mud and stubbornness, people held fast to whatever they could. Some clung to the cross. Some clung to a cold piece of iron. Others to the brief fire in the bottle, but all of them, whether saint, sinner, or something in between, were just trying to make it one more day. One more week. one more winter. Tonight, as you close your eyes and the wind brushes against your window pane, remember that shelf. Remember the stories behind each object. The man who read scripture while cleaning his gun. The woman who poured whiskey for her dying child and then lit a candle and prayed. The boy who picked up all three and asked what kind of man he was supposed to become. Because sometimes history isn't just in the battles or the monuments. It's in the quiet things. People carried to stay alive. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight, as the wind taps softly at your window and the hush of evening settles in, let's take a step back in time once more, to a place that was neither church nor saloon, neither home nor jail. And yet somehow, it was all of those things, combined. Let me take you inside the beating heart of any frontier town, the general store. Forget the bright aisles and shiny floors you might know today. There were no shopping carts, no piped-in music, no automatic doors that opened with a sigh. The general store of the American West was rough, dusty, and dim, and it was everything to the people who depended on it. When a town first sprang to life, usually after a few tents and cabins went up, someone would haul in a wagon full of goods and set up shop. That shop might have started as a canvas lean-to, a pile of crates under a tarp, or a shack barely big enough for one man and a counter. But no matter how small it began, the general store quickly became the center of town life. From the outside, it might not have looked like much. A crooked sign painted by hand, a porch with two rickety rocking chairs, a hitching post stained with years of rain and dust. But step inside, and you'd find a world in miniature. Everything anyone might need, and a few things they didn't know they needed until they saw them. The shelves were cluttered, sometimes built from old railroad ties or mismatched planks. They held sacks of flour, tins of coffee, bricks of tea wrapped in brown paper. There were jars of hard candy, molasses, and pickled vegetables floating in murky liquid. Wooden barrels lined the walls, filled with nails, dried beans, and lye soap. Behind the counter, a box of revolver cartridges might sit next to a stack of hymnals. Tobacco leaves hung from the rafters. Rolls of calico fabric leaned against a barrel of salt. There was no order, no system. And yet, the storekeeper, always slightly stooped, always wiping his hands on an apron, knew where everything was. If you needed lamp oil, he could find it. If you asked for hair tonic, he had 3 kinds. If you were short on coin, he'd offer you a tin of corned beef and add it to your tab. A tab you'd promise to pay when the next harvest came in or when the next letter arrived with money from back east. Children came in wide-eyed, staring at the penny candy they might never afford. Mothers came for flour and left with gossip. Fathers came for nails and left with 2 stories and a sore back from helping unload a new shipment. The general store wasn't just a store. It was a bank, a bulletin board, a post office, and a courtroom. If someone got married, the notice went up there. If someone went missing, that's where you heard it. If you wanted to hire a hand or sell a mule, you left a note by the barrel of dried apples. Letters from distant cousins were delivered to the store, sometimes read aloud in front of a small crowd. News from the East Coast, a war, an invention, a death, passed from mouth to mouth like wildfire, starting from that cluttered counter where everything else began. It was also a place of negotiation. Prices weren't fixed. You could trade a chicken for a spool of thread or a day's labor for a pair of boots. Money was rare, and bartering wasn't just allowed, it was expected. You brought eggs. You brought butter. You brought homemade lye soap wrapped in cloth. And if you had nothing to offer, maybe the storekeeper needed help sweeping or stacking crates. Everyone had something, even if it wasn't much. But beneath the daily transactions and the chatter, the store held something even more precious: hope. Newspapers from St. Louis brought tales of invention and prosperity. Catalogs from Sears and Montgomery Ward let people dream of lace curtains, silver combs, and player pianos. A woman might come in for sugar and spend 10 minutes tracing her fingers over a picture of a dress she'd never wear. A boy might stare at a sketch of a bicycle, imagining what it would be like to fly down a dirt road faster than the wind. Those catalogs weren't just paper. They were windows into another world, into another life. And the storekeeper, bless him, always let people look. But the general store was also where you came when your heart was heavy, when a storm wiped out your crops, when your horse went lame, when your husband hadn't returned from the hills and it had been 3 days. The storekeeper didn't ask too many questions. He just handed you the tin of beans and said, "Pay me when you can." Sometimes he knew you wouldn't be able to. He helped anyway. Because out here, kindness was a kind of currency too. Of course, there were fights. Arguments over prices, accusations of short weight, or tensions between newcomers and old settlers. Sometimes the sheriff had to step in. Sometimes fists flew. But more often than not, the storekeeper played the peacemaker. He'd pour 2 cups of coffee, sit the men down on crates, and talk until the anger drained away like rain off a roof. He saw it all. He knew every family, every secret, every struggle. And somehow, with just a nod or a quiet word, he kept the town stitched together. Years later, when some towns grew and others withered, the general store remained. Even as banks moved in, even as real post offices opened, even as telegraph wires hummed overhead. Because it wasn't about convenience. It was about connection. And even today, if you drive through certain corners of the American West, you might see a wooden building leaning to one side, its sign faded, its windows dusty. Step inside, and maybe, just maybe, you'll catch a whisper of what once was, the soft creak of floorboards, the scent of molasses, the weight of a time when everything you needed fit inside one room. So tonight, as you drift to sleep in a world of endless choices and next-day deliveries, think of that store, lit by lanterns, warm with the scent of wood smoke and flour, and full of voices echoing across a wooden counter. Because sometimes the smallest place held the biggest dreams. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight, as frost settles on the windows and the world outside slows to a hush, let's push open a set of bat-wing doors, worn smooth by weather and time. Listen. Do you hear the faint clink of glass? The gentle shuffle of boots on dusty floorboards? We're stepping into the saloon, not the wild movie version filled with brawls and broken chairs, but the real, breathing heart of frontier nightlife. In many towns, the saloon was the first structure to go up after the general store. It was built fast, cheap, and without apology. A single room with a long wooden bar, a few cracked mirrors behind it, and mismatched tables scattered like driftwood in a sea of dirt. If the town had only one piano, chances are it sat in the saloon. Out of tune, yes, but beloved. Some saloons were little more than tents with whiskey. Others became elaborate, 2-story buildings with balconies, velvet drapes, and polished brass spittoons. But whether grand or grim, the saloon played one simple role. It was where people came to forget. Forget the loneliness. Forget the loss. Forget the endless dust, the failed crops, the ache in the bones that wouldn't go away. You didn't need money to enter a saloon, though it helped. What you needed was a reason, and out here, everyone had one. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and spilled liquor. The floor creaked with every step, sticky in places where beer had soaked through the planks days before. The bartender, always watching, always listening, polished glasses that hadn't been truly clean in months and poured drinks with the indifference of a man who'd seen too much. The shelves behind him held bottles with faded labels, bourbon, rye, gin, something that might have started as rum and ended up as turpentine. There were no cocktail menus, no garnishes. Just pour. Drink, repeat. But it wasn't just alcohol people came for. It was company, conversation, the comfort of laughter, even if it was slurred and short-lived. At one table, a trapper told the same story about the bear that bit off his toe. At another, a traveling salesman bragged about a tonic that could cure baldness, gout, and heartbreak. In the corner, a miner sat silent, eyes far away, one hand curled around his glass like it was the only thing keeping him here. And then there were the games. Poker was the favorite, though rules varied town to town. A lucky hand could buy you a new pair of boots. A bad one could cost you the shirt off your back or your life. Dice clattered across wooden tables. Chips, made from bone, metal, or whatever was at hand, passed from calloused fingers. With every bluff and fold, the stakes were often low, until pride got involved. That's when chairs scraped back. That's when the room held its breath. Violence didn't always happen, but when it did, it was fast. A word too loud, a hand too quick, a misunderstanding between strangers who'd both had too much and too little. And sometimes, by morning, the town had one fewer resident, but not every night ended in gunfire. Most ended in song. Every saloon had its version of music, sometimes a fiddle, sometimes a banjo, often just a piano missing a few keys. And then there were the voices. Not trained singers, but women who earned their keep by making the room feel less empty. Saloon girls, they were called. And they were misunderstood as often as they were admired. These women weren't all what the rumors claimed. Some danced, some sang, some simply listened. They wore colorful dresses and practiced the art of smiling through exhaustion. They learned how to calm a drunk without offending him, how to steer conversation away from danger, and how to keep secrets safe in their aprons. Many were alone. Many had been abandoned. Some had dreams tucked inside the locket around their neck, of trains that would one day carry them away, or of farms they'd never seen but still believed in. They weren't just entertainment. They were survivors, like everyone else in the saloon. Sometimes the preacher would come in, not to drink, but to talk, to offer a word of grace, a warning, a prayer. Sometimes he'd stay for one quiet drink, then leave before the piano started. No one judged him. After all, even a man of God needed a place to sit down once in a while. And sometimes children peeked in through the doors, wide-eyed, wondering what magic lived inside. They'd be shooed away, of course, but not always harshly. Everyone had been young once, curious once, before life on the frontier hardened their skin and quieted their dreams. As the night wore on, the saloon changed. Laughter grew softer. Conversations slurred into murmurs. Someone passed out under a table. A woman sang a lullaby no one recognized. A miner counted coins he didn't remember winning. And the bartender, tired, unshaven but still standing, wiped down the same spot on the bar he'd wiped an hour ago. Outside, coyotes howled. Inside, humanity held on. Because the saloon, for all its chaos, was a place where people came to be seen, to be heard, to remember, even for a few hours, that they were more than just hands in the dirt or names on a ledger. They were people, tired, broken, laughing, hopeful, and when morning came, the saloon emptied. The piano went quiet. The chairs were overturned. The stories of the night scattered like dust in the wind. But the next evening, when the sun dipped, low and the lanterns were lit again, they returned. They always returned. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let the weight of the day slip away, think of that room full of strangers and songs, of laughter that didn't last, but mattered. Anyway, of women in bright dresses and men with dirt under their nails, just trying, to feel a little less alone. Because sometimes history isn't just in battles or ballads. It's in the quiet corners of forgotten rooms where people clung to music, to stories, and to each other, sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight. As the cold night hums gently through the trees, let's return to that saloon from last night. The place where dust and drink met beneath the flicker of oil lamps. But this time, we won't focus on the bottles or the cards or the men hunched in silence. Tonight, we listen for music, and the women who sang it. They were called many names: saloon girls, dance hall girls, soiled doves, songbirds, and sometimes worse. But to the men who wandered through the wooden doors of a frontier saloon, these women were more than titles. They were warmth. They were rhythm. They were the only color in a world gone brown with dust and gray with hardship. Most people think they know what these women were. The stories say they sold themselves, sold lies, sold dreams. But the truth, as is often the case in history, is more complicated. Yes, some did what they had to do to survive. But many were simply performers, singers, dancers, listeners, survivors. They came from all over: New York, New Orleans, St. Louis, even Europe. Some had once studied piano in parlors. Others had run from factories and farmhouses. A few had never known a safe home to begin with. They arrived in towns with names like Bitter Creek, Dead Horse, and Whiskey Bend, knowing full well what awaited them. Leering eyes, rude jokes, danger, and yet they stayed. Because even in danger, there was power. Power in being seen. Power in turning every gaze in the room. Power in commanding attention with a laugh, a wink, or a perfectly timed song. A typical night began with music. The piano, always out of tune, always adored, would ring out the first notes. One of the girls, maybe Clara or May or Ruby, would rise and step into the flickering light. Her dress was stitched from worn satin, her cheeks rouged just enough, her boots scuffed from dancing on uneven floors. But when she opened her mouth to sing, the room shifted. She didn't need to be perfect, just loud enough to drown the silence, just graceful enough to make the men forget their losses, just clever enough to slip past their sorrows. The songs varied. Some were silly and full of double meaning, tales of whiskey and women and misbehaving mules. Others were soft ballads carried from the East. Love songs sung through cracked voices, their sweetness all the more moving because it was so rare in a place like this. And when they danced, oh, how they danced. Not the polished waltzes of city halls, but a raw, lively two-step, skirts flying, boots stomping. They'd spin between tables, laugh with one man, tap another on the shoulder, and lead him to the floor with the grace of someone born on it. The music didn't stop until the girls were breathless and the floor was scattered with spilled whiskey and stories better left untold. But beneath the sparkle, there was exhaustion. The women worked long hours, often 6 or 7 days a week. They had to be charming, smart, alert, especially in rooms full of men who forgot their manners with their sobriety. They broke up fights, settled bets, and smiled through sorrow. And when the music ended, many retreated to small rooms behind the saloon, not glamorous quarters, but tiny spaces with creaky cots, tin basins, and maybe, if they were lucky, a curtain for privacy. Some saloon girls had protectors, bartenders, who watched their backs, or fellow women who looked out for one another like sisters. Others relied on instinct. A fan held a certain way. A glance to the mirror behind the bar. A silent signal that said, "Help me." Because for all their strength, the frontier was still a dangerous place for women without status. Yet somehow, they endured. Some eventually married, to cowboys, to merchants, to sheriffs who saw more in them than the dresses and songs. Others saved every coin, dreaming of opening a boarding house or buying land of their own. A few simply disappeared, riding off on stagecoaches to new towns, new names, new lives. They didn't always leave behind stories. History didn't often write their names down, but their impact lingered. They brought joy into places that had none. They reminded tired men of songs their mothers once sang, They gave laughter to towns built on hardship. They brought melody where there was only the sound of boots, guns, and silence, and perhaps most importantly, they created space for softness in a place ruled by steel and grit. Even the toughest saloon keeper knew, if the music stopped, the town grew colder. If the girls left, the place lost its soul. Years later, when historians wrote about the frontier, they focused on the men, the miners, the outlaws, the marshals. But behind those stories, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of a voice singing through smoke, a laugh that cut through sorrow, a melody that made a man believe, even for a moment, that life was still worth living. So tonight, as your room grows quiet and the world fades to black, think of her, not as a stereotype, not as a scandal, but as a woman in a faded red dress, stepping onto a crooked saloon floor, breathing deep, and singing the night into something beautiful. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story, tonight. As the cold gently presses against your walls and sleep begins to settle in your chest, let me take you to a place most people on the frontier feared more than a saloon brawl or a winter storm. Not the graveyard, not the gallows. No, I'm talking about the place people visited only when they absolutely had to. The doctor's chair, or at least what passed for one. Out on the frontier, doctors were a rare breed. A town might be lucky to have one. More often it had none. And if it did, well, doctor could mean many things. He might be a retired military medic, or a preacher with some knowledge of herbs, or a traveling man with a box of tonics and a head full of Latin terms he barely understood. But whether trained or not, once a man called himself doctor, people had no choice but to believe him. Medical degrees? Those were optional. What mattered more was confidence. A doctor had to speak firmly, carry a black bag that rattled, and nod as if he understood the human body better than it understood itself. Because when someone staggered into town with a bullet in the thigh or a child burning with fever, there wasn't time for second opinions. And so, the cutting began. Let's start with bleeding. Yes, bleeding. For centuries, people believed that illness came from bad blood. Too much blood, dirty blood, angry blood. The solution? Let it out. So the frontier doctor would slice open a vein, usually in the arm or neck, and let the blood flow into a bowl, sometimes a pint, sometimes more. And if the patient didn't faint or die, that was considered success. If he had leeches, even better. He'd place the slimy creatures on the skin and let them drink their fill. The idea was balance, that by draining the bad humors, the body would reset itself. And while this sounds horrifying now, at the time, it was hope. There were other treatments, of course. For a fever, the doctor might prescribe quinine if he had it. If not, willow bark tea. If the patient couldn't swallow, he'd rub whiskey on their gums and hope for the best. For a cough, he might offer a syrup made from molasses and turpentine. For pain, laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol. It was cheap, available, and effective. At least until the patient became addicted or stopped breathing. And for broken bones, well, that depended on who was around. Some doctors knew how to set them, wrapping limbs in splints made from fence posts or barrel staves. Others simply gave the patient a bottle of whiskey, told them to bite down on leather, and pulled until they heard a pop. Surgery? It happened. But only when there was no other choice. There was no anesthesia. Only strong liquor and strong men to hold you. Down! Tools were boiled if time allowed. Most often, they were wiped on a dirty apron and reused. Speed mattered more than precision. If a leg had to go, it went fast, with a saw that had served just as well on wood the day before. And the barber? Oh yes, he played a role too. Barbers weren't just for beards. They often pulled teeth, lanced boils, and applied leeches. Some even performed minor surgeries. That's why the barber pole, red and white, came to symbolize not just shaving cream and scissors, but blood and bandages. You could walk into a barber shop for a trim and leave with fewer teeth and less blood, all with the same tools. But not all was grim. Some frontier healers were skilled. A few had real training. They brought books, kept journals, experimented with herbs, and cared deeply for their patients. They sterilized their instruments with fire. They learned from mistakes. They wrote letters to universities back east. And most importantly, they listened. And the women, oh, how much they carried. Frontier wives, mothers, and midwives knew more about practical medicine than many, who called themselves doctors. They made poultices from onions and garlic. They used goose fat on burns. They boiled water for hours before childbirth. They knew how to treat scurvy with dandelions and stomach worms with walnut hulls. When a baby wouldn't come, when a man's wound wouldn't close, when fever swept through town like a silent killer, it was often a woman with a basket of herbs and steady hands who stood between life and death. But even the best efforts often weren't enough. Children died of measles. Grown men collapsed from infected cuts. Women bled out in childbirth. There were no antibiotics, no x-rays, no vaccines. Life was fragile. Bodies broke easily. Death came quickly, and so people turned to faith. They prayed. They lit candles. They whispered scripture. They made deals with a God they barely understood, begging for another day, another breath, another chance. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, the doctor closed his bag, tipped his hat, and walked into the dust, the same way he'd arrived. But don't think of him as a villain. Think of him as a man trying to make sense of a world that bled too easily, trying to fix what time, disease, and bullets kept breaking, trying, even when he knew he'd fail. Tonight, as you lay under clean sheets, in a room warmed by wires and light, think of the patient on a wooden table, clutching a Bible, tasting iron, hearing the rasp of a bone saw. Think of the mother, grinding herbs into a paste while her child burned with fever. Think of the barber cleaning his razor with whiskey before stitching up a stranger. Think of the doctor, eyes red with sleep, hands shaking, heart heavy, still answering the knock at midnight. Because history isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's just human. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight, as the hush of sleep settles over your room and the stars blink softly outside, I want to take you somewhere often forgotten in tales of the Old West. A place not marked by violence or dust, but by chalk, slates, and the fragile hope of a better life. We're walking into the one-room schoolhouse on the American frontier, where learning was as dangerous, daring, and difficult as anything else in the Wild West. It wasn't easy to build a school in a place where most people could barely build a roof that didn't leak. It wasn't easy to teach in towns where winter lasted 6 months, where children were needed on the farm, and where books were as rare as gold dust. And yet, they tried. They tried because they knew, without knowledge, the next generation would be stuck in the same mud, same mistakes, same struggle. So somewhere between the saloon and the church, a plot of land was cleared. Timber was gathered. Nails were begged, borrowed, or forged. A stove was placed in the center. Desks were hammered together by hand. A flag, often tattered, was pinned to the wall. A Bible sat near the front. And if they were lucky, a bell hung outside. Cello. Building was simple. No insulation, one door, a window or two, a chalkboard if the town had the money. If not, children used slates, wiping them clean with rags or the sleeves of their shirts. There were no grade levels, no lockers, no cafeteria, just a room, a teacher, and whatever children the wind hadn't carried away that year. And the teacher? Oh, the teacher. Most were women, often young, unmarried, barely older than their oldest students. Some had finished school themselves just a year or two prior. Others came from back east, sent by churches or reform groups to bring light to the wilderness. They arrived alone, carrying a trunk, a bundle of books, and a spine of steel. She taught every subject, reading, writing, arithmetic, history, scripture, to children aged 6 to 16, sometimes all at once. She kept order with a ruler, a sharp glance, and the quiet command of someone who knew this might be the only classroom her students would ever see. She was also custodian, nurse, counselor, disciplinarian, and librarian. If a child scraped a knee, she bandaged it. If one cried from hunger, she gave up her own biscuit. If someone whispered profanity, she washed their mouth out with soap and then helped them spell the word correctly. And discipline wasn't gentle. Corporal punishment was expected, sometimes required. A wooden switch for backtalk, a dunce cap for laziness. But it wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Because if she lost control, the classroom collapsed. Children came barefoot in summer and frostbitten in winter. Some walked 5 miles each way. Some brought siblings too young for school and let them nap in corners. Others arrived hungry, having eaten nothing but cornbread and weak coffee since dawn. They sat on splintered benches, hunched over with calloused hands better suited to milking cows than holding pencils. But they came. They came to spell freedom and America, to copy lines of scripture, to chant multiplication tables, to practice penmanship, even if their only ink came from berries crushed in a tin. Lessons began with a prayer. Then the teacher might read aloud from McGuffey's Reader, a treasured book of stories, poems, and morals. She'd write words on the board and have students repeat them. They'd recite, copy, recite again. There were no distractions, no phones, no electricity, just the scratch of slate pencils and the occasional sneeze. And still, somehow, there was joy. Children whispered jokes when the teacher turned her back. They shared apples from home. They carved initials into their desks and passed notes folded like tiny birds. At recess, they played with hoops, ropes, or just the wind. And if the school had a piano, even a broken one, someone would tap out a song and they'd sing, off-key but loud. In winter, the classroom grew bitterly cold. The stove might give out halfway through the day. The ink froze in bottles. Breath fogged the air. Still they came, wrapped in blankets, warming hands by the stove before writing their lessons. And when spring brought floods, or summer brought rattlesnakes, or fall brought outlaws nearby, they came anyway. Because deep down, their families knew. Learning to read might mean the difference between being cheated and being free. Learning to write might one day let them send letters to sons far away. Learning to think might mean they could break the cycle of poverty. Education on the edge of civilization was an act of rebellion. Against ignorance, against despair, against the idea that survival was all life had to offer. Of course, not everyone stayed. Some boys left school at 12 to help in the fields. Some girls vanished after marriage or tragedy. Some schools closed when teachers left or when money ran out. But even then, the memory of the lessons lingered. And decades later, when those same children became parents or mayors or merchants, they remembered the woman in the one-room schoolhouse who taught them how to spell their name. They remembered how she read poetry by lamplight, how she held their hand when they cried, how she believed they were capable of more, even when the world didn't. So tonight, as you lay in your bed beneath electric lights and digital screens, think of the little schoolhouse standing stubborn against the wind. Think of the cracked slate, the squeaky chalk, the frozen inkwell. Think of the child who sat in the back row dreaming of something more. Think of the teacher who gave them the tools to reach it. Because sometimes, the bravest, people didn't carry guns or wear badges. Sometimes, they carried books. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight. As the night grows still and shadows stretch across your walls, let's meet a man who walked a dangerous line between order and chaos. He didn't have a cape. He wasn't always noble. And more often than not, he was the most frightened man in town. But he carried something heavy on his chest, a six-pointed star made of tin. Tonight, we walk beside the lawman of the American frontier. He went by many names: sheriff, marshal, constable, sometimes just Jim. And while the title sounded official, the reality was much rougher. In most towns, there was no formal police force, just one man. Sometimes elected, sometimes appointed, sometimes he simply stepped forward when no one else would. He didn't wear a uniform. His badge might have been hammered from scrap metal, pinned crookedly to his vest. His gun might have been borrowed, his horse, half blind. And yet, when trouble stirred, and it always did, people looked to him. He was expected to stop fights, break up mobs, chase down thieves, settle land disputes, escort prisoners, and sometimes dig graves. And all for pay that barely covered. Bullets. But make no mistake, being a lawman was more than chasing bad guys. It was about judgment, about knowing when to draw steel and when to use silence. Every day, he made choices. Hard ones. Who to arrest, who to forgive, when to look the other way, when to knock on a door at midnight and tell a mother her son wouldn't be coming home. Some lawmen were brave, some were broken, some were drunk by noon and dangerous by sundown, and a few were legends. There were sheriffs who disarmed whole towns with just their voice. There were marshals who rode into gunfire for men they barely knew. And there were peacekeepers who never fired a shot, because they knew that respect was a better weapon than fear. But there were also the others, the ones who took bribes, who turned their backs on justice, who let prejudice and power rot their soul, because a badge didn't make a man good. It only made his choices heavier. And those choices, they came fast and hard. Imagine it. A stranger rides into town. He's wearing 2 pistols, looks around too long, asks too few questions. The CY's storekeeper is nervous. The banker locks his door. The sheriff watches from the porch of the jail, thumbs hooked on his belt, heart ticking like a clock made of sand. Does he confront the stranger? Welcome him? Wait, one wrong move, and blood will spill in the dust. Now imagine this. A drunken ranch. Hand stumbles out of the saloon, pistol waving, shouting at the sky. Children run. Women scream. Someone yells, "Sheriff!" He comes, slowly, calmly, his voice steady, eyes sharp. He talks the man down. Or he doesn't. Sometimes the gun goes off, and when it does, the lawman writes the report in his own notebook. No backup, no supervisor. Just him. And his conscience. Most nights, he slept in the jail, a building no bigger than a stable, its cells made from old iron and good intentions. Inside, he might have 2 drunks, 1 pickpocket, and a boy who stole apples because he hadn't eaten in days. There was no police academy, no training, just instinct, and a deep understanding of people, their fears, their lies, their hopes. The lawman had to read men the way others read maps. Quickly, carefully, without getting lost. He kept the peace not with force, but with presence. He showed up at funerals, hands folded. At weddings, hat in hand. He danced at barn socials, slow and stiff, to remind folks he was still human. And when violence came, and it always came, he stood between it and the town. Not because he had to, but because no one else would. Some lawmen died young, some grew old and quiet, some vanished without a trace, buried in unmarked graves far from the badge they once wore. Others became folk heroes, their names etched into history with more myth than truth. But most were just men. Men who tried, who failed, who got back up, who walked alone at midnight down Main Street, listening for danger in the wind, who looked out for children, who arrested their friends when duty called, who sat at their desk long after everyone else had gone to bed, wondering if they'd made the right call. And often, they hadn't. But they kept going anyway. So tonight, as your house sits quiet and warm, think of the man standing in the middle, of a dirt road, hat low, hand near his belt, heart full of doubt. Think of the badge pinned over his ribs, close enough to feel every breath. Think of the people who hated him in the morning, thanked him in the evening, and depended on him all the same. Because sometimes history isn't about grand victories or famous names. Sometimes it's about one tired man with a badge doing his best in a world without guarantees. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight. As snow drifts quietly beyond your window and the world fades to stillness, let me tell you a story not of gunfights or gold, but of letters, of photographs, of promises sealed in wax and sent across thousands of miles. Tonight, we speak of the women who crossed an entire continent for love, or at least the hope of it. In the rugged, isolated towns of the American frontier, men outnumbered women by 5 to 1, sometimes more. They came west in waves, miners, trappers, cowboys, railroad workers. And while they brought tools, grit, and ambition, they left behind something just as important: companionship. A town could have a saloon, a general store, even a church. But without women, it couldn't grow, it couldn't soften, it couldn't last. And so a strange and quiet industry began to blossom, one built on ink, hope, and second chances. The term mail-order bride might sound crude to our modern ears, but in the 1800s it was seen as something noble, practical, even romantic. Here's how it worked. A man, lonely perhaps, or simply ready to start a family, would place an advertisement in an Eastern newspaper. It might read something like, "Widower, 32, owns modest farm in Nebraska Territory. Seeks lady of good character for companionship and marriage. Must enjoy quiet evenings and strong coffee." Simple, honest, often a little desperate. And on the other side of the country, in New York, Boston, or Cincinnati, a woman might read that ad while working at a textile mill or boarding with 3 other families in a narrow tenement. She'd wipe flour from her hands or coal dust from her dress and pause. Maybe she was an orphan, maybe a widow, maybe just a young woman with no dowry, no prospects, and no one to call her own. She would write back a letter, a photograph, if she had one, a story, carefully folded and mailed to a stranger who might, in time, become her husband. Some women corresponded for months before deciding to travel. Others boarded trains after just a few exchanges, chasing a promise that felt better than the life they were leaving behind. The journey was long. Trains, stagecoaches, ferries, dust in the eyes, cold in the bones, and the question, always the question, will he be kind? When the bride arrived, the town gathered. Everyone came to watch. The children stared. The men tipped their hats. The other women, some wary, some warm, waited to see what kind of person she would be. Sometimes the meeting was sweet. 2 people, both worn by life, locking eyes and recognizing something familiar. Sometimes it was awkward. Silent meals, nervous glances, the long work of turning a stranger into family. And sometimes it didn't go well at all. There were stories, real ones, of women abandoned at the station, of men who lied about their farms, their names, their tempers. There were heartbreaks, escapes, in rare cases, tragedies. But more often than not, something remarkable happened. Two people, brought together by paper and loneliness, learned to build a life. The woman planted flowers outside the shack. She mended clothes. She taught children how to read. She swept the floor while her husband chopped wood. She cried when she missed home. She laughed when the chickens escaped. She stitched hope into every corner of that tiny, fragile house. And slowly, the town began to change. The presence of women reshaped everything. Saloons quieted. Churches grew. Schools opened. Streets were named. Homes were painted. Babies were born. It wasn't just that women brought beauty or calm. It was that they brought balance. And they weren't weak. No, not at all. These mail-order brides were among the bravest people in the West. They left everything they knew, traveled into the unknown, slept beside men they had never met, endured isolation, childbirth, winter, hunger, and still woke, up every morning to try again. Some eventually returned east. Others stayed forever, their names carved into family Bibles and headstones. A few opened boarding houses. Some taught school. Others became midwives, nurses, shopkeepers, pillars of the towns they helped create. And when the railroads reached farther and cities grew and history began writing itself in steel and brick, instead of dust and pine, those early wives were still there, watching from porches, holding babies, and remembering the moment they stepped off that train. You won't find their names in most textbooks. You won't see them in statues or stamps. But without them, the West would have remained a place of drifting men and empty rooms. Tonight, as you lie beneath clean sheets and think of your own path, think of the woman on a train, her hands shaking, a letter folded in her pocket, and a stranger waiting on the platform. Think of her courage, her risk, her choice. Because sometimes, the greatest journeys don't end with gold or glory. Sometimes, they begin with a letter. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight, as the night hums low and quiet outside your window, we step away from romance, gunfights, and grit, and walk towards something far more practical, something no one wants to talk about, but everyone had to face. Let's visit a town where survival wasn't just about bullets and blizzards. It was about where to go when nature called. Welcome to a place with no plumbing, no pipes. Welcome to the frontier town without toilets. In the 1800s, the American West wasn't exactly known for its modern comforts. And while most people imagine the hardship of long winters and empty pantries, few stopped to consider this truth. There were no bathrooms, not indoors, not attached to homes, not with warm water or scented candles. What existed was the outhouse, and even that was a luxury. Let's start with what most folks did. Dig a hole, a pit, a trench, a corner behind the barn, maybe surrounded by some wooden planks, maybe not. Some were covered. Others were nothing more than a designated patch of dirt with a bit of hope and a shovel. And when it came time to build something more permanent, they constructed the outhouse, a wooden shack just big enough for one person with a door that didn't always latch and a crescent moon carved into the wood. Why the crescent moon? Some say it helped identify the women's outhouse, with the sun for the men's. Others say it let light in during the day. And some just liked the way it looked. The truth? No one really knows. But nearly every child on the frontier saw that moon and dreaded the walk toward it on cold mornings. Inside, you'd find a wooden bench with a hole cut into it. Beneath that, a deep pit. And depending on the season, you might also find wasps, snakes, or ice. Toilet paper? No. People used whatever was available. Old newspapers, corn cobs, dried grass, pages from the Sears catalog, which, ironically, advertised fine porcelain bathtubs on one side and was used for wiping on the other. The smell? Exactly what you'd imagine, but worse in summer. Families learned to hold their breath. Some burned sulfur or hung herbs. Others gave up and accepted that life was pungent. And yet the outhouse had rules. You didn't hog it. You didn't tip it over. At least not unless it was a prank and not occupied. You didn't go out alone at night without a lantern. And you never, ever forgot to check for spiders before sitting down. For women, the walk to the outhouse was a daily danger, especially at night. So many used chamber pots indoors, tucked under beds or hidden behind curtains. Children used them too. And if there was no pot, a bucket. And in the morning, someone carried it outside. Bathing was a related challenge. Most homes didn't have bathtubs. Families used wash tubs filled with water hauled in by hand, warmed over a stove. Baths were rare, weekly, sometimes monthly, and the whole family shared the same water, from oldest to youngest. By the time the last child climbed in, the water looked like soup. Soap was homemade, lye, animal fat, and strong arms. Shampoo didn't exist. People used vinegar, baking soda, or just time. Hygiene, in short, was a creative act, and yet people adapted. They developed routines. They placed the outhouse where wind wouldn't blow the smell into the kitchen. They sprinkled lime in the pit to cut the stench. They hung a mirror on the inside door for shaving or adjusting hair. Some even wallpapered the walls with leftover newspaper clippings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. In larger towns, there were public facilities, bathhouses, sometimes connected to saloons or general stores. For a fee, a man could sit in warm water and remember what comfort felt like. Women often had fewer options, relying on privacy, patience, and a friend who knew how to heat a kettle fast. Diseases related to poor sanitation were common. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid. Doctors warned people to keep latrines far from wells. Some listened, some didn't. And winter was the worst. Imagine walking across snow with bare legs and a lantern, wind biting through layers, only to sit on frozen wood and pray you didn't slip. Many folks avoided it altogether, using chamber pots or simply holding it until morning. There were stories, funny ones, usually told by grandfathers at kitchen tables, like the boy who brought a skunk into the outhouse by mistake, or the farmer who got locked in by a jealous rival, or the preacher who dropped his Bible into the pit and declared it beyond salvation. Laughter, after all, was one of the few comforts people had, especially when dealing with the less glamorous parts of life. But beneath the humor was truth. People endured. They endured without plumbing, without privacy, without even the comfort of running water. They endured with dignity, with routine, and with the firm belief that tomorrow would be a little easier, or at least a little warmer. And slowly, change came. Indoor plumbing appeared. In the wealthier homes first, then hotels, then schools. Cities got sewer systems. Rural towns caught up decades later. By the early 1900s, the outhouse became a relic, still used in some places, but remembered mostly as part of a harder, smellier past. Today, we flush without thinking. We complain when the hot water runs out. We light candles in restrooms and debate tile colors. But once, it was a moon-carved door, a seat over a pit, and the sound of wind in the boards. So tonight, as you drift into sleep in comfort, take a moment to honor the people who built a life without it. The mother lighting a lantern at dawn, the child balancing a bucket of water, the grandfather chopping wood for the Saturday bath, the family laughing in a one-room home where the bathroom was always outside and never warm, because history isn't just in battles and laws. Sometimes it's in how people faced the smallest moments of the day with strength, humor, and a very strong stomach. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight, as the fire crackles low and the air turns still, I invite you to sit at a rough-hewn table next to people you've never met. A family of 5, their hands calloused, eyes tired, but hopeful. The table is uneven. The light comes from a single oil lamp, and the meal simple, sparse, earned. Tonight, we share supper on the American frontier. Food in the Old West wasn't about flavor. It was about survival. Calories mattered more than seasoning. Filling the belly came before pleasing the tongue. And yet, even in the hardest times, there was care in every crumb. Most frontier families grew what they could and preserved what they couldn't finish. A garden behind the cabin might offer beans, squash, carrots, and onions if the soil was kind. Chickens, if you had them, meant eggs. A cow meant milk, unless she went dry or wandered off. Meat came with risk. Hunting was essential, not for sport, but for life. Venison, rabbit, squirrel, even possum found their way into the pot. Wild birds were prized, though hard to catch. A man might spend half a day tracking one prairie hen, only to miss with a single shot, and go home empty. And then there was salt pork, the great equalizer of meals. Cured in barrels, packed with brine, it lasted through storms and seasons. Salty, greasy, sometimes more fat than meat. But it was a gift in winter when fresh food vanished beneath snow and silence. Flour was sacred. Every household guarded it. When shipments didn't come, the town went without. A sack of flour could make biscuits, pancakes, dumplings, bread, gravy. And when it ran low, women scraped the bottom of the barrel with quiet worry. Cornmeal was another staple. Boiled into mush, baked into cornbread, or fried into cakes. Cheap, filling, versatile. Sweeteners were rare. Honey if you had bees, molasses if you could trade. Sugar was expensive. Most children knew sweetness not from candy, but from apples dried last fall, or a carrot stolen from the garden. And coffee. Oh, coffee was gold. Frontier families reused grounds 3 or 4 times. Some boiled acorns or roasted chicory as substitutes. A hot cup, even if bitter and thin, was a comfort no one took for granted. Breakfast was the most consistent meal because it came with the fewest expectations. Corn mush, fried bread, sometimes bacon or beans left from the night before. Eggs if the hens cooperated, and always something hot to drink. Dinner, or supper, was where the effort showed. A pot hung over the fire all day, filled with whatever was available. Bones, scraps, herbs, root vegetables. It simmered slowly, its scent spreading through the cabin. And when night came, the family gathered. Not around plates, but around the pot itself. There were no courses, no forks sometimes. People dipped, shared, wiped bowls with bread or their fingers. Silence wasn't rude. It meant the food was good. Holidays brought out the hidden jars, preserved peaches, pickled beets, jam made from foraged berries. Children's eyes lit up at pie. Adults lingered over second helpings. It wasn't just about flavor. It was about memory, of home, of years when things were easier, of mothers who had long since passed. And then there were the hungry days when crops failed, when winter came early, when the hens stopped laying and the traps came up empty. That's when ingenuity took over. Families ground acorns into meal, boiled tree bark into bitter broth. Dandelions became salad, wild onions became stew. Sourdough starters were fed with hope more than flour. And still, they shared. Neighbors helped neighbors. A woman with too many turnips traded for eggs. A man who caught a deer gave half to the widow next door. Because out there, food was not just fuel. It was kindness. But the truth is, frontier cooking wasn't glamorous. Fried salt pork, beans, hard biscuits, coffee boiled until black as tar. Yet every meal was a victory. A declaration, we are still here. Children learned to cook early, girls at 5, boys by 10, if their mothers were gone or sick. Recipes were passed by memory, not paper. A pinch of this. Knead until, it feels right. Stir until your arm aches. Cooking was done by feel, by instinct, by necessity, and it wasn't always safe. Open fires, cast iron pans heavier than a child, exploding pots. Burns were common, so were accidents with knives, axes, and boiling water. But no one complained. There was no time, no choice, and yet there was beauty. The quiet of a mother kneading dough by candlelight, the hiss of bacon on a skillet at sunrise, the laughter of children chasing chickens before supper. The way a man said thank you not with words, but by refilling his wife's bowl first. Even the simplest food carried meaning. A biscuit, warm from the fire, told a story of hands that never stopped working. A pot of stew meant someone cared, enough to wait. A jar of jam, opened in mid-January, was proof that summer had once existed. And sometimes, that was enough. So tonight, as you fall asleep in a world of refrigerators and microwaves, think of the pot hanging over the hearth. The mother stirring slowly, the father carving meat with a dull knife, the children reaching for the last piece of cornbread. Think of the silence before grace, the steam rising in the cold, the hunger met with effort, not convenience, because history isn't just in wars and laws. Sometimes it's in the meals that kept people standing. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight, as quiet settles over your room and the moon casts a gentle light through your window, I invite you to a place where contradictions lived side by side, in dust, in faith, in fists. A place where the same man who knelt in prayer on Sunday morning might throw a punch on Saturday night. Welcome to the rhythm of frontier life, Sunday church, and Saturday fights. Out on the American frontier, life was raw. Days were hard, nights were longer, and survival demanded strength. Not just of body, but of spirit. And so, people clung to whatever gave them meaning. For many, that meant God. Church was rarely a building, at least not at first. It might have been a clearing in the woods, a barn with the hay pushed aside, or the back room of the general store, where sacks of flour sat beside Bibles and hymnals. The congregation wasn't large, a dozen souls, maybe 20. Families in their best clothes, which meant the cleanest shirt, a mended skirt, and boots wiped free of mud. Children squirmed, on benches made of planks. Mothers shushed them with soft hands. Fathers bowed their heads, sunburned and silent, and at the front. The preacher, sometimes ordained, sometimes self-taught, sometimes just the only man willing to stand up and speak. His voice wasn't always polished. His coat might have been too short in the sleeves. But he held something precious in his hands. Words that reminded people there was more to life than work and weather. He spoke of grace, of justice, of a better world beyond this one. He reminded the townsfolk that kindness mattered, that forgiveness wasn't weakness. That heaven could begin with how you treated your neighbor, even if that neighbor's pigs kept getting into your garden. People listened. They sang hymns off-key and out of time. They passed the hat, even when there were only a few coins, to give. They prayed for rain, for peace, for their children. And when the final Amen echoed through the room, they lingered, they talked, they laughed. They shared food from baskets, cornbread, pickles, boiled eggs, preserves. It wasn't just worship. It was community. But then came Saturday. Saturday was payday, if there was any pay at all. It was market day. It was bath day. And it was drinking day. After a week of digging, stitching, milking, and hauling, men sought relief in the saloon, or whatever passed for one. They threw back whiskey, played cards, told stories, laughed too loud. And if the drink flowed freely and the air grew tense, fists started to fly. Arguments began over spilled drinks, over cheating hands, over who got to dance with Ruby or Clara or May. over old grudges carried like weapons beneath dusty coats. Sometimes it ended with a push and a laugh. Other times, it ended with broken teeth and broken ribs, and occasionally, though rarely, with blood on the floor that stained until the next storm washed it away. The preacher might walk past the saloon on those nights shaking his head. He might say, "A quiet prayer for the men inside." And on Sunday, some of those same men would sit on the front bench with bruised jaws and bandaged hands, eyes cast down, hearts full of regret. They didn't always apologize, but they showed up because they needed the words. They needed the chance to try again, to be reminded that one fight didn't define them. Some towns tried to clean things up. They posted notices. No guns in town limits. No drinking on the Sabbath. No fighting within 100 feet of the church. But rules only went so far. Human. Nature didn't change just because someone painted a sign. Still, people tried. A woman might hold her husband's arm tighter on Saturdays. A shopkeeper might close early just to avoid the rush. A child might peek through the saloon window, wide-eyed, watching men act like boys. And the next morning, those same men would help fix a broken fence, would carry firewood to the widow down the lane, would kneel on creaky floorboards and ask. Forgiveness with heads bowed low. That was the strange balance of frontier life. Saturday was loud, rough, messy. Sunday was quiet, clean, redemptive, and in between those days was life. Real life. Imperfect, tangled, full of contradiction. The preacher knew it. The sheriff knew it. The women at the well knew it. No one expected saints. They just hoped for effort. Because out there, where storms ruined crops, where babies died in the night, where news came a month late and love came even slower, people clung to what they could. And if that meant fighting on Saturday and praying on Sunday, so be it. They were human, just like us. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in a world of calendars and reminders, think of the town where Saturday fists gave way to Sunday songs, where the same hands that struck were folded in prayer, where redemption wasn't an idea, it was a rhythm, because sometimes history isn't clean or tidy. Sometimes it's full of bruises and blessings side by side. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight. As your world grows still and the hum of silence wraps around you like a blanket, I want to tell you about the sound that once made hearts leap in towns far from anywhere. It wasn't a bell or a gunshot. It wasn't the whistle of a train. It was the sharp, sudden cry, "Mail's here!" Out on the American frontier, where days blurred into seasons and loneliness settled like dust, a letter could mean everything. A single sheet of paper, creased, worn, sometimes tear-stained, was a bridge between one life and another. But getting that letter? That was an act of patience, of faith, of daring riders and dusty trails. That was the work of the post office, and for a brief burning moment in history, of the Pony Express. Let's begin with the post office. In most frontier towns, the post office wasn't a marble building or a dedicated facility. It might have been a corner of the general store, or a crate behind the saloon bar. Sometimes it was just a wooden box nailed to a post, guarded only by habit and decency. The postmaster wasn't a government agent, at least not always. He might be the storekeeper, the blacksmith, even the town's only literate resident. He sorted letters by hand, called out names when the stagecoach came, wrote "no such person" in careful script on mail that had waited too long for a home. There were no set delivery times, no tracking numbers. If a letter came at all, it was a small miracle, because to get there, it had to survive dust storms, bandits, swollen rivers, broken wheels, and sometimes war. And that's where the Pony Express entered. It began in 1860, a bold, almost foolish idea. Hire young men, fast riders, Give them the lightest possible mail bag. Station fresh horses every 10 to 15 miles. Then ride, day and night, through snow and heat across plains and mountains, from Missouri to California. Almost 2,000 miles in 10 days. The riders were boys mostly, teenagers, skinny, tough, armed with revolvers, sometimes Bibles. They carried the mail in a leather mochila, a special saddlebag with locked compartments. Time was sacred. A rider might gallop into a station, leap off, switch horses, and be gone in under 2 minutes. They rode through storms, past buffalo herds, over steep cliffs. Some were chased by outlaws, others by wolves, and a few never made it to the next stop. But they rode anyway, because people were waiting for news of a mother's health, for word from a sweetheart back east, for business contracts, birth announcements, one-line prayers. The Pony Express didn't last long, just 18 months. The telegraph made it obsolete, but during its brief life, it captured the imagination of the country. It proved that even the wildest, most disconnected corners of America could be reached, not by force, but by hope, wrapped in paper. And long after the Express ended, the need remained. People still gathered around the mail wagon when it arrived. Children chased after it. Women stood quietly by the postmaster's door, hands clasped. Men leaned against door frames, hiding nerves beneath stoic looks. And when your name was called, your heart stopped. You unfolded the letter slowly. Sometimes the words were joyous. Sometimes they were devastating. A new baby, a death back home, an apology, a confession, an offer. Some letters were read aloud, shared with the whole family. Others were hidden in aprons, read again and again by candlelight, the paper growing soft with use. And sometimes the letter never came. Days turned into weeks, weeks into seasons. And still, you waited, because hope on the frontier was often made of silence, and the belief that somewhere, someone was writing your name. Mail wasn't just about information, it was about connection, identity, memory. It reminded you that you were still part of something, even if the town around you was shrinking, even if the trail was snowed in, even if the only other sound was wind through cracked boards. There were times when the mail brought money, a crisp bill folded between 2 pages. Times when it brought heartbreak, a letter that began with, "I'm sorry." Times when it changed lives, a government notice, a land deed, an invitation to return home. But always, it brought feeling, real, raw, ink-stained feeling. And when no one received mail, people shared their disappointment quietly. A shrug, a soft sigh, a glance toward the road, already planning for next time. Because there was always next time. Even now, if you walk into a dusty old post office in a town forgotten by time, you might feel it, the echoes of waiting, of hoping, of names once called out and faces once lifted toward the light. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, with messages one tap away and the world at your fingertips, think of the boy galloping through snow, carrying a letter sealed with longing. Think of the woman who waited 3 months to know if her son was alive. Think of the man who read the same line over and over until it no longer felt like a dream. Because sometimes history doesn't arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in an envelope. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight. As your eyes grow heavy and the world softens around you, let's step into a memory. Not yours, but someone's from long ago. A child born into dust, into danger, into wide skies and wooden cabins. Let's remember what it was like to grow up in the Wild West. It wasn't like the books. There were no carefree rides into sunsets, no sparkling creeks filled with laughter. Childhood on the frontier was work. It was wind. It was learning the weight of responsibility before your feet barely reached the floor. Most children were born at home, in log cabins, dugouts, or sod houses. No hospital, no doctors, unless you were lucky. Their first sounds were not lullabies, but the crackle of fire and the moan of winter wind. From the moment they could stand, they helped. At 3 or 4, they fetched water, gathered eggs, shushed younger siblings. At 5 or 6, they learned to churn butter, feed pigs, mend socks. By 10, many could shoot, plow, or ride better than most grown men today. There was no childhood the way we know it now. There was only life. You lived it early. You carried it fast. A boy might start his morning milking a cow, chopping wood, and checking traps, all before breakfast. A girl might start baking, sewing, tending the stove, and caring for a baby brother with no complaint and no rest. Play? Oh, there was play. But it came in short bursts, like sunlight between clouds. Children made dolls out of corn husks, played tag among haystacks, built pretend forts from kindling and rocks. If they had a hoop and stick or a carved wooden horse, they guarded it like treasure. Laughter still lived, it just had to share space with work. School was a blessing and a burden. Some kids walked miles to the nearest schoolhouse through snow or summer heat, carrying slates and biscuits wrapped in cloth. Others didn't go at all, kept home to help with chores. And yet, many learned to read by firelight, from Bibles, from worn readers passed down so many times the covers barely held on. Books were magic. Stories meant escape, even the hardest. Fathers grew quiet when their daughters read aloud. But life was not safe. Sickness came quickly and stayed too long. Croup, fever, infection from a scraped knee. Many children died young. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics. A cough in the night could steal a child by dawn, and yet, somehow, the others kept going. They learned to ride horses bareback at a gallop, learned to spot a snake in the grass before stepping, learned to cook, fight, trade, and pray, all before their voices changed. They grew up watching their parents build homes from nothing, bury neighbors too soon, and face each season not with fear, but with focus. And they inherited that grit. By 12, a child might be in charge of a full day's work. By 13, some were sent alone to drive cattle or deliver goods or carry a rifle across empty plains. But there was tenderness, too. A mother brushing the hair of her daughter with fingers calloused from laundry. A father carving a wooden whistle by firelight for his quiet son. A family gathering to sing before bed, off-key, tired, but together, and holidays. Oh, how they mattered. Christmas meant one orange, maybe a peppermint stick. Birthdays meant a song, a hug, maybe a new pair of socks. These small joys felt bigger than the world because they were earned. And yet, in all this, children remained children. They giggled when someone fell in the mud, whispered secrets under patchwork quilts, stared wide-eyed at trains or fireworks or letters from distant cousins. They believed in magic, even when they had to feed chickens before sunrise. Some of these children grew up to be sheriffs. Some became teachers, mothers, ranchers, preachers. Others faded into the dust, names forgotten, stories lost. But in their time, they were the quiet thread holding the frontier together. While adults fought for land and law, it was children who gave the West its future. They were the promise, messy, loud, stubborn, hopeful, that life could continue even in the hardest soil. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think of the little boy balancing firewood taller than himself. Think of the girl sweeping dirt floors before learning to write her name. Think of the children who lived without toys, without cartoons, without safety, and still found wonder in a snowflake, a butterfly, a warm biscuit from a mother's hand. Because sometimes, the bravest hearts don't belong to warriors. Sometimes, they belong to children who simply carried on. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story, tonight. As the wind whispers gently outside and your room holds steady in the dark, I want to take you somewhere that never held still. A place where skies could shift in minutes, where dust could bury hope, and where a single cloud could decide the fate of a family. Let's talk about the weather. Not the kind you chat about in passing, but the kind that changed lives. On the American frontier, weather was not a topic. It was a force. People didn't check forecasts. They looked at the sky, sniffed the wind, watched the birds. They read the behavior of animals, the way the grass leaned, the ache in their joints. And even then, they were often wrong, because the frontier didn't care about signs. It changed when it wanted to, and when it did, you prayed. Let's start with dust. It wasn't the kind you wipe from a shelf. It was a living thing. It seeped through every crack in the wall. It coated teeth, bed sheets, and soup. It turned clean water into mud with a single gust. Dust storms swept in without warning, towering walls of brown that roared like freight trains. You'd see it, coming from miles away, boiling across the plains like a judgment. When it hit, people ran. They stuffed rags in the window gaps, tied scarves around their mouths, covered babies with wet towels, and then they waited, eyes shut, breath shallow, hands holding on to anything solid. Afterward, everything was coated. Tables, clothes, skin, memories. Some people never stopped coughing. Now the cold. Winter didn't arrive politely. It crashed in, with sleet that sliced your face, with wind that howled through walls, rattled lanterns, and froze water inside your house. Frostbite wasn't rare, nor was starvation. If you hadn't stored enough firewood or canned enough food, winter might be your last season. Cabins became bunkers. Families slept in one room to conserve warmth. Beds were piled high with quilts, fur, anything that held heat. The stove never went out. If it did, someone, usually the oldest child, had to run barefoot to the woodpile at dawn, praying the fire could be saved. And outside, white silence, miles of snow, no footprints, no sounds, just wind and white pressing on the roof like a second sky. But winter, as cruel as it was, had a rhythm. You could prepare. Tornadoes gave you no such chance. Out on the open plains, the sky could split in half with no warning. A still, humid afternoon. Birds go quiet. The air turns green. Then comes the sound. Not thunder, but a low growl, like the earth clearing its throat. And then, the funnel. Tall, spinning, black as regret. It didn't glide. It hunted. People ran for root cellars, storm pits, holes dug deep into the ground, behind the barn. There was no time to gather belongings, no time to shout, just a scramble, a slamming door, and a prayer that the ground would hold. Some sat in darkness for minutes, others for hours, listening to boards rip, glass shatter, animals scream, and when they emerged, if they emerged, the world had changed. The roof gone, the barn flattened, the wagon in a tree, or worse, someone missing. Still, they rebuilt, nailed boards back into place, replanted the garden, stitched new curtains, hung up the cross again, even if it was cracked down the middle. Because they had no choice. And yet, for all its violence, the weather brought gifts. After the storm came quiet. After the freeze, the thaw. After the dust, the rain, sweet and heavy, washing everything clean. Rain was joy. Rain was life. Children ran barefoot through puddles. Women placed buckets outside to catch the water. Men leaned against posts and let it hit their faces like a blessing. The dry earth drank it greedily. So did the people. There was beauty, too. Sunrises that painted the land in gold. Snow so pure it made silence sacred. Thunderheads rolling in like opera. Rainbows stretched. From ridge to ridge, and the wind, always the wind, singing its long, low song through grass that danced without shame. People learned to read the land like scripture. They knew where the snow drifted deepest, where lightning struck most often, which trees bent with the wind and which ones snapped. They lived by nature's moods, not above them, and while some cursed the sky, others thanked it. Because in the end, the weather wasn't the enemy. It was simply the world speaking in its own language. Language of clouds, of cold, of sudden light, a language that taught humility and resilience. So tonight, as you sleep safe beneath solid walls and storm-proof windows, think of the family crouched in a cellar, holding each other while the sky tore above. Think of the child wiping dust from her plate, the father chopping wood before the sun rose, the mother closing her eyes to hear if the roof would hold. Because sometimes history isn't told in words. Sometimes it's written in weather. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight, as your breath slows and your body sinks deeper into stillness, I want to take you to the one truth that every man, woman, and child on the American frontier carried like a shadow. Not war, not hunger, but this. Death came quick, not with fanfare, not with ceremony. It didn't knock. It slipped in quietly, between chores, between seasons, between heartbeats. It came during harvest, during childbirth, during a morning ride that never made it home. Out here, life was never promised, and no one pretended otherwise. They didn't speak of death like we do now, with distance and softness. They knew it. They buried it. They cooked dinner after it passed. A child might die from a splinter gone wrong. A man might never return from checking traps. A woman might bleed out on the floor she swept that morning, her baby crying quietly, in a cradle made of pine and hope. One moment you were boiling coffee. The next, you were gone. Even the tough ones, the lawmen, the cattle drivers, the mothers with hands like tree bark, knew they were always one fall, one bite, one infection away from vanishing. And so they lived with death, not around it. They built their homes knowing they might not outlive them. They carved gravestones with the same knives they used to carve bread. They wrapped infants in blankets sewn from fabric left over from burial gowns. But here's what might surprise you. They weren't afraid, not like we think. Because when death is everywhere, you stop flinching. You hold your children tighter. You tell stories around the fire. You laugh louder. You pray harder. You live more honestly. Grief was a thread in everything. It showed up in lullabies sung a little too soft, in the way someone lingered at a name etched into wood, in how folks would leave one extra chair out of habit and then pretend they didn't notice it was empty. Funerals were simple, not because they didn't care, but because there wasn't time for drama. A wooden box, a few words, a hand on a shoulder. Then someone fetched water. Someone fed the mule. Life kept going. But the mourning, the real mourning, stretched longer than the prairie horizon. It sat behind the eyes. It echoed in the pauses of a sentence. It was passed down in recipes, in lullabies, in the way a son walked just like the father he never met. Some tried to outrun it. Whiskey helped, for a while. Others turned to scripture, to ritual, to superstition, hanging horseshoes above doors, whispering to the wind, placing rocks in certain patterns on the earth as if that might keep the reaper guessing. But none of it stopped what was certain, so people made peace, not with dying, but with living while they could. They kissed longer. They sang off-key. They let children run barefoot through danger because joy was worth the risk. They planted apple trees they might never see fruit from because someone else would. And slowly, almost without noticing, they built something eternal, not stone monuments, not legacies, but moments. Small, imperfect, utterly human moments that lit up a world always flirting with darkness. So tonight, as you lie safe beneath a roof that holds, in a world where help is only a phone call away, remember the man who never made it back from mending the fence, the girl who died before she learned to write her name, the mother who smiled through pain so her children wouldn't be afraid. And then think of the love they left behind, the quilts, the songs, the firewood stacked just right for a storm they wouldn't see. Because sometimes history doesn't live in timelines. Sometimes it lingers in the quiet after someone is gone. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story. Tonight, as the air outside holds its breath and the stars hang steady above your rooftop, let's take a step into something rare on the American frontier: joy. Because yes, for all its hardship, dust, and danger, the West still knew how to laugh. And more than that, it needed to. So tonight, we join the town not during storm or silence, but on the day of the celebration. And we stay long enough to see what happens after. Frontier towns didn't have parades every week. They didn't host lavish galas or balls. But when the crops came in, when a baby was born healthy, when someone returned from a long ride alive, they gathered. Maybe it was Independence Day. Maybe just a Saturday after 3 weeks of good weather. Whatever the excuse, they made it count. They built makeshift stages from wagon planks. They hung garlands of dried corn husks or prairie flowers. They dressed in their best, which often meant the shirt with the fewest patches, or the bonnet, least faded by sun, and for once, the town looked alive. The general store put out free lemonade, warm but sweet. Children raced through the streets, chasing hoops or pulling each other in carts. Fiddles began to sing before sundown. Dancers followed, clumsy, joyful, boots thumping dust into the sky. There was pie, always pie, and whiskey, sometimes hidden, sometimes not. Even the preacher came, though he stayed near the edge, nodding politely as the music grew rowdy. The sheriff leaned back on a barrel, watching with a rare half-smile. Mothers laughed without wiping their hands first. Fathers tried not to cry as their daughters spun in dresses sewn from feed sacks. It was joy, unpolished, hungry, and beautiful. But here's the thing about frontier joy. It was fragile, because sometimes the laughter hadn't even faded when something went wrong. A child tripped near a fire, a horse spooked and kicked someone square in the chest, a loose floorboard snapped during a dance, a pistol went off, not in anger, just in carelessness. 1 minute, music. The next, screaming. That was the thing about the frontier. You didn't get to choose when tragedy arrived, even in the middle of a feast. They called them freak accidents, though out here they weren't rare. They were just life, reminding everyone how thin the line really was. A boy might drown in the creek during a picnic. A firecracker might blind a young girl forever. A wagon wheel might give out during a parade and crush a man's leg. A man who danced just an hour earlier. And suddenly, the celebration became a funeral. Tables were cleared. Laughter froze. People spoke in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what had just happened. And still, the next year, they gathered again. Because if they didn't, they'd lose what little light they had left. They understood something that many today forget. Happiness is not a guarantee. It's an act of courage. To smile while the roof leaks, to dance while the wind threatens, to bake a pie knowing it might be your last one shared. That wasn't denial. That was resilience. So they kept celebrating, kept laughing, kept holding each other up when the barn doors blew open and joy scattered like hay in the wind. And when tragedy struck, and it always did, they responded the way frontier folk always did. They buried the dead, brought food to the widow, stood by the child who now walked with a limp. And then they sang again, sometimes quieter, sometimes louder, but always again, because they knew the truth. If you only celebrated when it was safe, you'd never celebrate at all. So tonight, as you lie safe beneath your roof, think of the dusty street lit by lanterns. Think of music played on worn fiddles by calloused fingers. Think of children running wild, unaware of what could go wrong, and that being the very reason they were alive. Think of the dance that ended in tears, and the ones that didn't. Because sometimes history isn't just the record of what happened. Sometimes it's the echo of laughter that refused to stop. Sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story, tonight. As your world quiets and the clock ticks slowly toward rest, I'll take you back to a town not marked on most maps. A place stitched together by fences, prayers, and handshakes. A place where everyone knew everyone. And that was both comfort and curse. Because in towns like that, the hardest thing to be was new. Let me tell you what happened when outsiders came. You heard them before you saw them. A wagon creaking where there shouldn't be one. A rider with a strange posture. A voice, not shaped by local dust. The sound made people stop. The blacksmith paused his hammer. The school teacher looked up from the primer. The children went silent, their games forgotten. And then, slowly, the outsider appeared. Sometimes it was a family, and tired, sunburned, with all they owned tied to the back of a mule. Sometimes it was a man alone, too quiet, too fast with his answers. Sometimes it was a woman, dressed finer than the land allowed, stepping carefully through mud with shoes that had never known dirt. The town watched. They didn't rush forward. They didn't shout. They just noticed. Because out here, strangers weren't entertainment. They were risk. Possibly a thief, possibly a fugitive, possibly someone bringing disease or trouble or something even worse, change. And yet, every single person in town had once been a stranger too. That was the contradiction of the frontier. It distrusted what it had once been. The preacher might be the first to approach, hand out, voice warm but measured. The storekeeper might offer water but keep one eye on the till. Children peeked from behind crates. The sheriff stood just far enough to not seem aggressive, but close enough to react if needed. Then came the questions. Where are you from? Where are you headed? Do you have family? Do you have a reason? And the answers mattered. Not just the words, the way they were said. Too confident, and you were arrogant. Too shy, and you were hiding something. Too perfect, and they assumed you were lying. If you passed that invisible test, if your answers didn't ring hollow and your smile wasn't too sharp, the town might open up inch by inch. A spare room in someone's barn. A loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. A job offer no one wanted. But even then, trust came slow. For weeks, you were the new one. People greeted you with caution. No one shared secrets. No one loaned tools. You were welcome. But you weren't in. Until one day, something shifted. Maybe you helped during a storm. Maybe you saved a child from a runaway horse. Maybe you stood beside someone when they were wronged. And suddenly, subtly, the town shifted its weight. Your name was spoken without hesitation. You were invited to Sunday supper. Someone said, "He's all right," and that was enough. But not every story ended that way. Some outsiders failed the test. They drank too loud, stared too long, asked about things polite folks didn't speak of, and the town responded without violence. Most of the time, just silence. A missing handshake. A room that wasn't available after all. A wagon mysteriously untied, and the outsider left, slowly, alone. Because frontier people understood something. You can't survive without community. But that community has to be earned, not demanded. There were exceptions, of course. The doctor no one liked but everyone needed. The barber who spoke too fast but gave clean shaves. The woman who baked better than anyone, so they forgave her politics. But for most, You had to become part of the story, not just pass through it. Still, there was beauty in the slowness. Because when you were accepted, truly accepted, you weren't just another face. You were someone they'd stand beside when bullets flew, someone they'd bring food to in the snow, someone they'd bury with respect, and mourn with real tears. So tonight, as you lie warm and safe in a world where introductions happen through glass screens and names can be forgotten in minutes, think of the stranger on the ridge, the way dust curled behind his boots, the way eyes narrowed in the shade, the way someone finally said, "Come on in then." Because sometimes history isn't just about who built the town. Sometimes it's about who was let in, sleep well, dream deeply, and I'll see you in the next story, tonight. As the world slows to a hush and your eyes begin to close, I want to take you back to a place you've visited many times in this story. A quiet town, a dusty road, a row of buildings worn by time and weather, the same town we've spoken of, with its outhouses, saloons, dances, deaths, and dreams. But this time, we walk it on its last day. No one ever says, "This is the end." There's no sign nailed to a post that reads, "Closing down." But you feel it. It's in the way the general store shelves are emptier than usual, in how the post. Office hasn't had a new letter in weeks. In the silence between neighbors, not angry, just tired. Some towns died with violence, fire, famine, flood. Others simply faded. And this one? It faded. Not all at once. First, it was the blacksmith, who left to follow the railroad west. Then the school teacher, who married and moved 2 valleys over. Then the preacher, who passed in his sleep, and whose church never heard a sermon again. One by one, families packed wagons. They didn't cry, not where anyone could see. They folded linens, closed shutters, left notes on doors that read, "Thank you," and they moved on. The last day wasn't marked by a speech. No one played music. There was no ceremony. It was just a Tuesday. Or maybe a Thursday. No one quite remembered. Only that by sundown the town would be still. But that morning, a few things still stirred. The saloon's door swung once more. The schoolhouse bell rang, though no one came. A girl drew hearts in the dust outside the cabin she'd never see again, and the sheriff, now old, now tired, walked Main Street one last time. Boots slow, hat low. He tipped it to no one in particular. The buildings sighed in the wind. Boards creaked. The well bucket swayed gently, though no one had drawn water in days. Someone left a pie cooling on a windowsill, maybe out of habit, maybe as a gift, maybe because they couldn't bear to leave the sill bare on the last morning. Out by the cemetery, someone planted wildflowers. No name on the marker, just petals, just respect. The animals had already gone, traded, sold, set, loose. The fields had grown wild again. And the sky? The sky watched, as it always did, without judgment. By afternoon, only a few remained. They stood outside their homes, holding nothing but memory. A wife touched the doorframe once more. A man looked at the porch he'd built with his father. A boy carved his initials into a tree before climbing into the wagon. And then they left, not in a rush, not in fear. But the way you leave a room you loved too much to say goodbye to out loud. The last to go turned the general store's sign to closed, even though no one would ever turn it back. By sunset, the town was still. No fire burned, no pot boiled. No boots scuffed the dirt, but even in that silence, something lingered. Not ghosts, not sorrow, just echoes. Echoes of laughter after Sunday supper, of piano keys struck in joy, of crying babies and horses' hooves and the sound of hammer hitting. Nail. And those echoes? They never truly go. Years later, someone might stumble on the town, find the shell of the saloon, the windmill frame rusted into the sky, the school bell lying half buried in prairie grass, and they'll feel it. Not fear, not loss, but presence. A sense that something lived here once, fully, bravely, messily, honestly, that people danced here, that people tried here, and that, even in its final breath, the town mattered. Because sometimes history isn't preserved in stone. Sometimes it's carried in silence. So tonight, as you drift into sleep and the story fades to dusk, think of the town that gave you these 20 nights, of its people, its dust, its light. And remember, not every ending is loud. Sometimes it's just the sound of one last door closing gently behind someone who loved a place too much to forget it. Sleep well, dream deeply, and thank you for staying with me. I'll see you in the next story.